Welcome to the November 2024 Fellowship of Reconciliation Gathering Voices. My apologies, the beginning of this recording is missing, but I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to Dr. Liliane Baxter, who I am so excited to have with us. Lili is a longtime Fellowship of Reconciliation member. And she comes from a particularly interesting background, having been born in a refugee camp in the wake of the Holocaust to survivors of the Holocaust. In 1979, she was appointed by Coretta Scott King to be director of the King Center's Nonviolence Training and Education programs. She continued in that capacity until 1992, when she returned to Emory University to complete her PhD. Being the child of Holocaust survivors, she has seen up close and personal the devastating consequences of hatred and violence. And she brought this to 13 years of directing Atlanta's Holocaust Education Center. And she's brought this as well to her role in the Fellowship of Reconciliation and our history, and her commitment to nonviolence and teaching it across the world, including in Japan, Russia, and Germany. And she's going to be going through with us, there's going to be part 1 of 2, but she's going to be going through with us King's 6 principles of nonviolence and 6 steps of nonviolence. So again, apologies that the beginning of this video is clipped, but please welcome Lili.
Another very important tenet is that all life is interrelated. We are all interrelated. All creation is interrelated. We are one human family, as Dr. King wrote about in the last chapter of Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos, Our Community, his last book. It was called The World House. We are one family living in a world house. And we want that world house to become a beloved community. And the way we're going to get there is by reflecting what the beloved community exemplifies: decency, harmony, an end to poverty, end to racism, and to homophobia, and to sexism, the various isms, and a way to live in reciprocity and ultimately in reconciliation, which is what we're about, or what FOR is about. And Dr. King talked about that the end is reconciliation and the beloved community. So that's where we want to go. We know that the way we do it is through nonviolent means. I had this image just this moment of being at a funeral at Ebenezer. Now, let me tell you a little story.
Can you push up your sound a bit? We're having folks say that they're having trouble hearing you, though not myself. And maybe
Okay.
move your computer microphone a little closer to your face.
Okay. How's
Wonderful, as that may help the sound.
that? Okay.
Great. Please go on.
Okay. I was working at the King. This is an image Mrs. King gave me of the beloved community. So I thought I'd share it with you since we're talking about the beloved community, because we have glimpses of it today. And this is an example of a glimpse of it. And this is of the funeral of a King Center staff member, actually a Southern white boy who became Mrs. King's press secretary. And he was organizing bikers. He was himself, a motorcycle rider, and was doing a great job. I mean, they were changing. All of a sudden, they were buying gifts Easter time for children. He was doing important work with his people. And he had a terrible accident and was killed. And his funeral, because everyone loved him and knew him, was Ebenezer Baptist Church, the old historic Ebenezer. And let me tell you about the ushers. On the one hand, we had the beautiful and elegant ladies of Ebenezer Baptist Church. At the helm, Dr. King's sister, Christine King Ferris. There they stood, in a row, greeting people. On the other side were bikers with people like the name, one was called Popeye, another was called Hulk, and they wore jeans and all the various regalia and those boots and of bikers. And they lined up on the other side, greeting everyone. Hello, my name is Hulk. Here, take a seat. And the mayor was there at that time. It was Andy Young. Everyone from SCLC was there. Everyone of every economic class, every ethnic group was there, because that's who Stoney was. And Mrs. King later, and I even read from a funeral that Reverend Roberts graciously let us have and wanted us to have at Ebenezer. And later that night, Mrs. King called me just to see how I was doing, because I was so crushed. He was like a brother. And she goes, today I saw the beloved community. She saw it in all the people who were there and in the love that was manifested toward this one person. And I know you've all had those experiences, one sort or another, and that's what can pull us forward. That is what can bring us, even during this difficult time, to a new house with no master in it, or all of us sharing in the power. So the 6 principles of nonviolence and the 6 steps for nonviolent social change. Nonviolence is the way.
As you were saying that, I was thinking of what we're headed into, and both the redemptive and the opportunity that will be there for us to come together as beloved community in as we face this coming challenge.
Yes. Would you like to speak more about that?
No, please go on. No, please go on.
Okay. Thanks. The 6 principles of nonviolence are somewhat different than what you see if you were to look at chapter 6 word for word. But this is what we believed at the King Center back in the early 80s, and through the 80s as we improved and worked on it, on these 2 in those days handouts, but 2 important pieces that are twin twin representations of 2 important aspects of Dr. King's nonviolence: the philosophy, which is in the principles, and the application and methodology, which is represented by the 6 steps. Nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Now, to thinking through the heroes of the civil rights movement, the heroes of the Velvet Revolution, the heroes, the nonviolent heroes that we admire, were all people of great courage. They were able to transcend fear, intimidation, pain, misunderstanding, because they believed in the cause and believed in how they could work to manifest it. So, along with that are some other insights. Nonviolence, Dr. King wrote, is not a method for cowards. Oftentimes people think that if someone is nonviolent, they are passive and unable to act. And they are unable to act because they're afraid. They are cowardly. That is not true. Instead of being passive, nonviolence is actually active, nonviolent resistance to evil. It's aggressive spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and only passive physically. And by that, I mean in terms of, there you are. Nice. Nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people, I'm sure. So let's move to principle 2. So nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. A very important, friendship and understanding are very important characteristics, not only of the beloved community, but how we're going to get there. We have to get over this duality of good and bad, enemy and self, other and me, I, us versus others, to extend ourselves in friendship to those who are different than us. And we do it because we want to understand them. We want to hear their story. We want to really know where they come from, what they believe, what they enjoy, what they are afraid of, all of it. And in the process, make friends. Some of this is happening in various dinners and various gatherings and various churches and other communities where unlike groups are coming together in friendship and changing things. Now, part of this second principle is also that nonviolence does not seek to humiliate the opponent. It's very important. Someone who was great at this was actually Andy Young, who always knew that it was important to save face of your opponent, but also that nonviolence seeks to awaken moral shame, conscience in the opponent. Because, as I've said before, the end of nonviolence is reconciliation. And the purpose of nonviolence is creation of the beloved community. And that in, a quick overview is principle 2. So let's move to principle 3. Can you, Ariel, can you flip that up? Principle 3? Well, then I'll just read it. Oh, Principle 3. Let me tell you what it is. Principle 3 is nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. You getting the pattern? The person is sacred. The person may act unjustly, may act with hatred, with fear, but nonviolent looks at the evil, the problem, and not the person who is perpetrating that evil or problem. In Montgomery, during the bus boycott, Dr. King would say again and again, we are out to defeat injustice and not white people who may be unjust. So nonviolence directs the attack against the forces of evil rather than against the person doing the evil. And nonviolence recognizes that the evildoers are also victims. They did not become hateful without having had certain experience, certain teachings, certain things that made them unjust, made them cruel. So again and again, nonviolence cherishes the person, recognizes the sacredness of each person, but recognizes that people can be led astray and behave in ways that don't uplift any of us. So now on to principle 4. We are going to get through this. I was afraid we wouldn't get through all 12, but we are. Can you show principle 4, Ariel or Susan? Thank you. This one is a toughie. Nonviolence holds that unearned suffering for a just cause is redemptive. That's very, very important. We had to insert for a just cause. I would say in the last 8 years, because there was such a misunderstanding. And rightfully, I don't think it was very clear. The earlier version of this principle had nonviolence holds that unearned suffering is redemptive. And that led to some really intense discussions on domestic violence. And that's not what nonviolence was focused on in this particular principle. It was saying this principle is very connected to the direct action campaigns. You know, this comes out of Strike Toward Freedom, the Montgomery campaign. This is where we find the 6 principles, the basics of the 6 principles. And we had to include for a just cause, because when people were trained, and they were trained in many ways by FOR folk, by John Swamley, not John Swamley, yes, John Swamley and Bayard Rustin. Imagine, and they would lead trainings at the churches, to stay nonviolent, various, very intensive trainings, so that when they went publicly, there would be absolutely no violence. This happened also in Birmingham, where they actually had a pledge of nonviolent discipline. And those folks who could not sign that pledge, who felt that if they were struck, they would have to strike back, were given other jobs, did not demonstrate, because it was absolutely essential that the evil, the violence, the hatred that was hidden would be brought out in these direct action campaigns. I'll get more into that with step 5. But right now, it's important for us to recognize that we needed to put in for a just cause, so that there would be no confusion as to what we were aiming at, which is to bring the hidden suffering, the hidden evil out in the open, and to reach the conscience of the individual and public opinion. And you know it happened. I mean, I know you're all familiar with Selma, the Selma campaign, which led to the Voting Rights Act. But people had to stay absolutely disciplined, and it was on the news. People were horrified at the horses, the beatings. As you know, John Lewis came very close to dying. Mrs. Boynton who was a leader of the voting rights in Selma, mistreated, mishandled, terrible, humiliating to our nation. Now, for that, they transformed people's thinking and recognized that this very same beatings, these very same actions were done in hiding. And now they were out for all to see. So, with that, nonviolence accepts suffering without retaliation and accepts the consequences of its acts. We'll get a little more into that in a minute. So that's principle 4. And let's move to principle 5, because this one is Dr. King spent the longest time on this particular one. So principle 5 is nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. And it was very important that we recognize the kind of love that he was talking about. And he spends a good deal of time distinguishing between 3 kinds of love that are found in the Greek New Testament. One is eros, the root of erotic, romantic love. That's a form of love and very important. Second form of love is philia, friendship. You love that person because they love you. You both think you're absolutely wonderful. It's a reciprocal kind of love, and very deep and very rewarding. And the third kind of love is agape, understanding, redeeming, goodwill, unconditional love. Dr. King described it as the love of God operating in the human heart. And the thing about that kind of love is it doesn't distinguish between those people who are worthy or unworthy of that love. There is no distinction between friend or enemy. That kind of love is directed toward both. And in his description is this wonderful description of describing this nonviolent love and calling it spontaneous, unselfish, creative. It just came out. It just comes out. It is spontaneous. It is so natural to the person. It just comes, flows out, is expressed. It does not regard the self. It really regards the other, and it's creative. It finds new ways of expressing that kind of love. I'm thinking of a story that I can't at the very moment. I'm terrible at people's names. My apology, it'll come to me. A story about the desegregation of movie theaters. Um, and, Black folks had to go upstairs and white folks were downstairs. And um, people are standing online, and maybe you'll know who I'm talking about or who you might have heard this story from. But they're standing online, and because they go up and try to buy a ticket, they wouldn't be given a ticket. They'd come back and they'd stand online. It was a direct action, and a person standing to the side walks up to this nonviolent resistor and spits in his face. And our friend's response was, "Have a handkerchief?" And the man was so discombobulated that he actually gave him a handkerchief. He wiped his face and gave the handkerchief back. Humor, creativity, it exists, and it's divine. It's divine. So nonviolence is not only of resists violence of the spirit, but as you see, also violence of the body, violence that comes from hate campaigns, and will not recognize that all life is interrelated. So agape love, which is expressed through nonviolence, love in action, is a love that is seeking to preserve and create community, beloved community. So let's move to principle 6. So what does it take, to feel this way, to believe that nonviolence will carry the day? Because in this teaching, in Kingian nonviolence, the universe is on the side of justice. Not only does the nonviolent resistor have a deep faith that nonviolence will eventually carry the day, win, exist, but that they can play a role in making this happen. And it is worth to, this particular kind of commitment. Because in nonviolence, or this kind of nonviolence, there's a long view of history. Long view of history. when Mrs. King called me to commiserate about the loss of Stoney Johnson, she also she reflected on her Dr. King's assassination, and I remember her saying, we may not know why something awful, something terrible has happened, some great tragedy has happened, but in the fullness of time, in years and decades, in centuries, she was talking about thousands of years, we will understand. For a child of Holocaust survivors, that's quite something to grapple with. But the nonviolent resistor has a deep faith in the future and yearns to be part of making that future a reality, a future of that we can all aspire to, of decency, kindness. You have all the adjectives and more. So that and we very quickly, because these we could go so deeply, and I'd be very happy if I could go deeply into all of this with you, many of whom could teach this better than me. But I think at 15 minutes we might as well just do Q&A, and maybe another time we can move more into the 6 steps. But I want to say just one thing about the 6 steps right now. And if you could, and you'll see in a minute why, if Ariel, you could put back that slide, please.
Sure, just one moment. Do you want the original first slide?
Yeah, that would be great.
Just one moment. There we go.
Perfect. If you take a look at the 6 steps for nonviolent social change, please look at where direct action is. It is number 5, which means it's number 11 because the 6 steps are based on the 6 principles. And the various demonstrations that, yes, do use nonviolent tactics are not the nonviolence Dr. King taught. Dr. King taught a nonviolence that was based on these 6 principles and a little more, as I said, ends and means, beloved community. They're not so clearly in here. This is what he taught. And people who think they are walking in his footsteps because they have a they have a demonstration, they do not understand. And people who, well, let's not say anymore, but I just thought I'd share that with you because it's such a huge misunderstanding and great frustration for those of us who teach nonviolence and watch people just think that they've got it all because they're marching. And then, are hateful to the people who disagree with them. And on and on. So it is an important discipline. It's a very important practice. We have to commit ourselves to it if we want to be nonviolent. If not, we are just really interested in methodology, but not a way of life. And even that, hardly. So, because the methodology also needs a philosophy. It's just rooted to that. So perhaps now, if you have any questions. Yeah, Ariel?
Yes. Start with myself just saying I've been reading through A.J. Muste recently. He was a prolific writer on pacifism and nonviolence. And one of the things that has stood out for me is he talks about how we can't simply use the same blueprint for one issue to the next. And that brings me back to that, where you talk about information gathering and education. And so how we get at that type of strategy, right? Rather than that simple, as you said, marching or number of people being arrested as is common these days. And so I wonder if you have words of wisdom for us as we go into this second Trump administration uh, with a plan for resistance, right? We know so many people are making a plan for resistance in this next administration. And so I wonder if you have words of wisdom for how to do so from this perspective, right? From information gathering and education and principles behind it strategically.
Since I haven't discussed the 6 principles and information gathering and education,
Well, how about applying
I
the principles? Yeah.
say a little more, Ariel. Let me understand it a little.
Yeah. What advice would you give to, say, young people today going into the second Trump administration and planning resistance? So what advice for how to do so uh strategically and with deep thought?
Well, then, my answer will be they need to take nonviolence workshops, and you need to gather a group of young leaders, people very close to their age, who speak their language, who understand their worldview, and have them learn Dr. King. It's not, as you see, it's not impossible. It takes deep thought, important conversations, strategizing on an issue, of really becoming expert in that. If you want to know about information gathering, it is, I mean, Dr. King said we needed to know whether there even was an injustice. There are people who, may say somebody has done something, and we know that that's the case with what is it, the kittens and the puppies being eaten, and everybody believes it. I mean, really knowing, really doing research, really knowing the truth before they already are, but out there demonstrating. And that can be difficult. You can start demonstrating with education. You can already be out there marching with education. The second step, because you want to education, it has to do with educating others, is the is bringing your issue to the front, bringing it out, showing it to people, representing it to people. And I mean creative ways, puppet theaters, other ways than marching, but that's also a direct action, and a valuable one in just showing, as you said, numbers. These are the number of people who were arrested. But if it isn't grounded in the 6 principles, in these basic principles of nonviolence, then they are going to what? Vilify anyone who is different than them, and get further from the beloved community. So they need to, as I see it, they need to get some training, and they need to get training by young people.
So I have a question from Jeffrey, our dear friend, Jeffrey Wilkinson, author of the book, The Wall Between, What Jews and Palestinians Don't Want to Know About Each Other, along with Raja Corey. And I'm going to add a question that I haven't related to that book to his question. He says, do you see nonviolence as the absence of violence or the presence of love and compassion? Could you talk a little bit about what must fill the void created by rejecting violence. Is what you are saying that creating a beloved community is what replaces violence? And I want to add where you see the role of of meeting each other where they are and having conversation. And I say that because Jeffrey and Raja talk about how we talk over each other, right? And we talk from that place of emotion without hearing the other person's pain and trauma.
Yes. You mentioned the absence of violence and the presence of compassion. They're both, it's a both and, it's not an either or. Um, the absence of violence is one thing and very important, physical violence, but the presence of compassion is also important. But they both, to me, in fact, Dr. King was very influenced by Hegel and the notion of creative synthesis, of bringing two opposing things together and creating something new. He wrote, and I would recommend for, I'm sure many of you have read, but Strength to Love, which is now called Gift of Love. Strength to Love is Dr. King's collection of sermons. And you can imagine, I mean, he's talking about everyday life in a sermon. He's talking about, yes, the movement, but he's also talking about how do we live? And so I love that book. And in his opening sermon, which is called A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart. Now, tell me that's not a good description of a nonviolent activist. And he says that life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony. Put that together. Life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony. So what seems like an opposite, like the first idea, the absence of violence, and the other side, the presence of compassion, it really, Dr. King talked about nonviolence being able to reroute the human desire for action by having getting people out and doing things. So both are important, and both work together in an interesting synergy. So life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony. I could have explained it a little better. Sorry.
I think that was fantastic. And I think it answered Jeffrey's question about a void, right? About the absence of violence creating a void, and about how to speak to and hear each other from opposite sides.
Because, yes, you can create something you never have thought of.
Right.
If you listen to and are in dialogue with someone very different from you will create something that you would not have thought of. If you're only with like-minded people, then what you are getting is your answer, your own solution. But when you're with others who are different than you, then you come up with new things you hadn't anticipated before. And couldn't have. I see so many of my dear friends, I get stuck kind of like, oh my goodness, there's Bernard Meyer, there's Phil Bentley, there's Susan McCarthy. I'm just thrilled.
Oftentimes, when I talk to people about FOR and my own commitment to nonviolence as the method of social change, and what I oftentimes hear from folks in disagreement will say that successful social movements, and they'll point to, say, apartheid, the ending of apartheid in South Africa, or the ending of slavery in America, included violent resistance. And I wonder how you think Dr. King viewed such events, um, and how you yourself view those that question, right?
That's a good question because I think there's some misunderstanding. Um, Dr. King understood the necessity for self defense. And I think that a system like slavery, especially the cruelties that existed there, and no other means of stopping that cruelty, and um, it was, to me, acts of defense, just as my great heroes are the resistance fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They had no other means. Now, Dr. King distinguished between cowardice and and as did Gandhi, and defensive violence. There was also no question that offensive violence was not. I mean, this was, strategizing wars, all of that was against everything Dr. King stood for. But he himself gave up um, ownership, gun ownership, but he absolutely understood that there are people and they needed to defend themselves. And I think this is also where, if we had more time to talk, the fourth principle about suffering for a just cause um, comes together. Um,
Yeah, so
I hope
as
you
we're
get this.
at time, I would love to ask you to come back and join us for a second half in the new year, say January or February. We can chat about a time and we can do a very quick review of the six principles and then move into the six steps and a longer Q&A for folks. So I want to just thank you so much. Before you leave, I have just one more question, which is how you encountered Fellowship of Reconciliation and what about FOR spoke to you then and speaks to you now?
Well, I was recruited by Richard Dietz and someone named Bill Anderson, who was a psychologist at the University of Virginia. They came to visit me when I was at 503 Auburn in the earliest years of my working at the King Center. And then in 1990-91, I was asked to join a delegation of nonviolence trainers and peace educators to go to the Soviet Union, which at that moment was dissolving. And FOR had been invited by the Soviet Peace Committee to teach nonviolence. This was the period of perestroika, a new age. Yeltsin had just been elected mayor of Moscow, and uh, and 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 we used the six principles and six steps throughout our trainings. We did trainings in Moscow for an organization called Golubka, which means dove in Russian. We also did trainings in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan, always using the six principles and six steps. Um, there were Virginia Barron, maybe you remember her, and Paula Green. Some of you I know do. Um, were part of the delegation and asked and nominated me to join the National Council. And I was elected and served um, for about 12, 13 years, and ultimately became the first Jewish chair of the National Council. Um, Back, I think, in 2002, no, something like that. I also was asked to represent the USFOR at the International FOR. And that was just remarkable. I wish you all could just see people from diverse countries who actually kind of look, dressed like themselves, spoke, were all together and all committed to nonviolence. It gave me um, a, such a sense of hope and recognized that there may be enclaves, just enclaves, small enclaves in all these different cities, all of us around the world pushing in the same direction. Because when we came together in E4, it really, I wrote a report about it, and it was one of my visions, but one of this vision of people so different and yet so loving. And I will tell you this, it meant so much to me. A young man from Japan who was um, actually Christian, when he learned that I was a child of survivors, we became friendly and were talking. And I was telling him about my background. He actually went down on his knees and asked forgiveness. And I will tell you, in all my years, no one else, non-Jewish or Jewish, has asked forgiveness. And that he did with such sincerity and such love, even though he wasn't even alive during that time. But as a Christian, he did that. And it was so healing for me. I mean, it was so vital. Um, so I have had a wonderful, wonderful friendships through FOR and E4. But that's my background with FOR.
And I'll say Susan and I right now are both blessed to be on the International FOR committee. And as you were saying that about the people from around the world, it just rang so true to me. Such different backgrounds and languages and skin colors and nationalities, and yet what we share is that commitment to building the beloved community, which can only be done through nonviolence. And I'm so grateful to be in community with you, Lili, and the entire Atlanta FOR chapter. And so I thank you again. And we had I wonder if actually as a follow-up to this, if you would, you mentioned a number of books and resources or pamphlets as you were speaking. And I wonder if you could provide us with a recommended resource reading list of some of those books that we could send as a follow-up.
Sure.
Great. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.